Hail, payment!
Oh, dear. Oh, God. Oh, no. No! Hi. Hello, everyone. I have seen the sights. I have stared twice into the maw of chaos, and I have returned with insights and critique and review, as is my job.
And I have booze. One sec. There we go.
And Henry has booze.
You can tell which one of us is the horror, right?
Yeah, okay, so to give a little backstory, I watched Hereditary both last night and this morning. That would be the second and third time I've ever watched it, and my reasoning was because the first time I watched Aster's debut feature, it affected me very strongly. I could not sleep for several nights after, but then months later, I had a lucid nightmare where I entered this state where I'm like, wait a second, Hereditary was scary, but maybe as a narrative, as a film, it doesn't fully gel. And I had this thought, and throughout the dream it was like, oh yeah, I figured it out. Hereditary doesn't work. This movie, it's all a fraud. It's all smoke and mirrors. And then I wake up and I entirely forget what my entire thesis was in relation to Hereditary.
So we've been trying to kind of re-induce that state in you and maybe get you back into the kind of dream realm where you can maybe rediscover those truths.
Yes, exactly, because it's important, because no thing should go uncritiqued. Even a movie that, after seeing it as many times as I did, I admit, is pretty genius. And to the point that, like, its construction and the way it's presented and just the sheer amount of stress it imposes on the viewer makes it somewhat thematically impenetrable to most people, because most people would not go the lengths to watch this. But naturally, I did go the lengths. In fact, I went as far as to play the soundtrack right after the movie as I was trying to sleep.
By the incredible composer and saxophonist Colin Stetson. Bravo for that soundtrack.
Yes, and let me tell you something. Colin Stetson's music is so gripping and so powerful, and at times so booming, that it is very difficult to fall asleep to, because you end up wanting to pay attention to it, because it's so intricate and interesting, and there are a number of moments where it will just cut off after a crescendo. So you get these moments of silence where you're like, oh, was I listening to something? And then the next one starts, and you're engrossed all over again. It's very difficult to fall asleep to. From this point onward, definite spoilers for Hereditary. This works best if you've already seen the movie. So we're not going to go into a summary, because this movie really needs to be... If you're going to experience it at all, just watch it. Just do it, knowing going in that there is going to be a lot of, like, familial strife. There is going to be some gore. There's going to be some disturbing
imagery,
sequences. There's going to be some nudity as well. There's going to be some people in there in the buff. So just be ready for anything when you go into this movie.
And I think the interesting thing about Hereditary is, for the most part, it's not exactly a groundbreaking premise. If you were to just pitch someone the idea of Hereditary, they'll think, well, fair enough, I'll give that a watch. But, like, it's really the execution that sells it.
And honestly, the execution, these last two times that I've watched it, again, the second and third time I've ever watched it, in the same 12-hour span...
4 of those 12 hours were Hereditary.
Yeah, okay, but I was bewildered by the structure, in fact, to the point that by the third time I was like, oh man, I am just admiring the beautiful symmetry of these gears turning. This no longer frightens me in the same way. It is more like I am elated to see this horrible machine work its dark purpose.
Hereditary is so much like a roller coaster, but like most of the movie is the bit when it's like clunk, 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 going up the coaster, and you're like, oh, this isn't that bad, this isn't that bad, and then you hit the drop, and the second drop, and the third drop.
Pro tip, and I'm saying this for my friend who is a fan of Hereditary and not a fan of roller coasters. If you can make it through Hereditary, you've made it through the worst part of every roller coaster. The tick, 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 tick. That is that tick, 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 tick is the sound of my soul watching Hereditary. Like a time bomb of fear, ready to go off in my dreams.
Hey, Gus.
Yeah? Fuck you! Oh god! No, look, I'm a professional review man. I'm a critiquer. I did this so that for you. I did this for you out there, viewers.
How did sleeping go after seeing Hereditary? Take us through that journey.
I'm gonna level with you. I had a very mundane dream.
Oh, what happened?
I guess I was at a funeral, but it was a funeral inside of a motel area, and the thing was everyone was wearing black and I was like wearing a ratty t-shirt and jeans, and people were like, okay, you need to get cleaned up, you need to take this funeral more seriously. And so they hand me a bar of like jet black soap
with the payment sigil carved into it.
No, just a bar of jet black soap, and it's like, this will help you. And I go and I take a shower with jet black soap, and I come back out into the motel, and the room where the funeral was is a fucking pool. And there's a bunch of, like, wild and crazy teens having a party. And I'm like, what is happening? What is this? And so, sure enough, you know, I'm just trying to, like, ask questions, seeing why everyone's here, and everyone gets in a car and just leaves me in this empty, like, pool room. And I don't even go in the water. I just stare, and I'm like, what the hell? What is this?
I like to imagine each of these, like, dream figures, you're approaching them and being like, so what did you think of Hereditary?
I don't know. I was trying to find out who died. Like, what was this funeral, you know?
Sounds like you had a time. I've got to say, the only remotely spooky thing that happened to me while I was watching it again this morning was, there's a bit where Meg called me, and I paused it, because I was watching it on Netflix, because we have it on Netflix here in the UK, if any of you are from the UK or have a VPN.
Mm-hmm.
And I like paused it to call to Meg. I looked back down, I looked at viewing time left, and it was 13 minutes, 13 seconds.
I gotta say, before we launch into, like, what the take is here, just so people don't get the wrong idea, I am very glad that I am a person who has very caring parents. I can imagine that for someone who did not have such a great home life, this movie is much, much, much worse on their psyche.
Yeah, I think for me, if I can be personal and vulnerable, as I believe all criticism should, I think being, trying to pretend you're objective is overrated. If I can lay my cards on the table, I also feel very privileged to have a very lucky home life, but I think it was a couple years before Hereditary first came out that my grandfather had to be committed to a care home because his Alzheimer's had gotten to the point where he couldn't live at home. And that was incredibly hard on my mum because she would go and visit him, and he passed away the day after Christmas, I think 4 years ago now. And I think since then, because I'm better now, but I used to suffer from quite severe, like, health anxiety. I would think I have different things, and one of the things that so terrified me, both for my own sake, but even more so for my mum's, was just this fear that the Alzheimer's would be hereditary because it's a genetic disease, and it can be passed down the lineage. Not always, but it can be. And I think, while this film is something that's, like, it can be read so many different ways, which is part of what makes it so brilliant, but I think this fear of either, in a more physical sense, something like intergenerational trauma and abuse, but also just the fear of inherited illness or, like, mental illness, which is a very kind of present idea in the film. So yeah, that I think is something that, like, really connected with me. I believe it's the only movie I've ever seen twice in cinemas.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, and I've seen it several more times since.
Gotcha. Yeah, the thing is, like, something similar, happened with my grandmother when she passed away, and she was in a home. And obviously, in this movie, Ellen is not really a beloved figure to this family. In a sense, we've all had like grandparents who maybe weren't quite themselves at the end, and I think this movie does a good job at touching on that kind of fear and anxiety that maybe if that happened to them, it might happen to us.
Yeah, and I think Hereditary in a lot of ways, what's so fascinating about it, and the reason that the two reactions that most commonly come out of it, well, three, is one, a very surface level thematic reading, two, like, just the very natural, like, wow, that scared the living piss out of me, and three, which is that, oh, that wasn't scary, people said that'd be the scariest movie of all time, and I didn't like it at all. And, of course, everyone's entitled to their opinion, but I think the third is because Hereditary, and I'm sure you're going to get into this, like, structurally and in terms of the way it treats its characters and ideas, it's something that is so different to, I think, what people come to expect from sort of mainstream mass media, that a lot of people literally, like, they don't know how to interface with it, and it's too distracting for them that it's so different to their frame of reference. Like, should I name names?
I literally may drag somebody for their terrible Hereditary video later in this,
Ooh.
but I want to wait until a while in, because we're not here for drama, and besides, the video I'm talking about already has comments and dislike disengaged anyway, but we'll get to that.
Yeah.
What's more important to me is that we analyze this film in perhaps a new way. A good Hereditary video, just to bring this up, was the Nick's Fears one.
Yes, that's a great one.
Yeah, where the interpretation is that this is an analogy for coming out as trans and the kind of betrayal that happens when a family does not
accept you.
Yeah, accept you, recognize your identity. I'd say Nick's Fears interpretation is really great, and it's really comprehensive, and it's a great way to read the film. Ari Aster, said that all the stuff in the film is meant to be interpreted literally, but not metaphorically. But that's kind of where we get Death of the Author.
I think Ari Aster is also a bit of a troll, to be honest. Like, he's very kind of playful.
So you're saying that he could be saying that, yeah, no, you're literally supposed to just take everything on the face of it, not read into it, like...
Yeah, no, exactly, like... No, exactly, like, let's be honest. You don't have multiple classroom scenes in a film discussing, like, the nature of tragedy, and you don't have all of these different layers to it if it's something that's like, no, this is just a movie about demons.
Yeah, no, you're right.
It's him saying, like, oh, it's all literal. Whatever you do, don't interpret it. Wink.
Ari Aster's a fun guy, honestly. Like, I think he's, one of most interesting creatives to enter horror, along with Jordan Peele. Like, the things that they're doing.
The interesting thing about Ari Aster is, and I don't know if you knew this, Gus, but I think it'll really interest you, Ari Aster is a, like, consummate film lover, and when he's not making his own movies, he is constantly writing articles for different publications about different movies he loves and, like, his critiques and opinions on them.
Oh, no shit.
So he's a guy who comes from, like, the critical background as well as a filmmaking background.
Oh, wow. So he's both a artist and someone who likes to dissect movies.
Yeah, no, exactly. He's an artist and a critic, and I think that level of, the ability to take apart a great piece of art and put it back together is something that is clear in the meticulousness of Hereditary's construction.
That is aspirational, honestly, because it's one thing to be able to take apart a broken car. It's another thing to fix the broken car.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's another thing entirely to design a car and then manufacture
it. Yeah,
exactly.
There's being a mechanic, there's being a manufacturer, and then there's just being someone who smashes the window out of a car because it doesn't do what they thought it would.
Without further pomp and circumstance, let's hear your Hereditary hot takes.
So, essentially, what I discovered after watching this film twice and taking notes on it the second time is that it is possible to read this movie as Annie being the antagonist, or at least being far more malicious than her perspective lets on.
Do you know what's fascinating? I'm really, I think there's real credence to this idea because friends of mine have watched this and throughout it, they've consistently thought, Annie was suspicious.
There's plenty of reason to think that she is suspicious, because at the beginning, she lays out this idea that her mother was a private person with private friends and private rituals who, when people disagreed with her, that was their opinion, and it was wrong. The main arc that Annie explores outside of the family is with Joan, a private friend who inducts her into a private ritual. And the way that she dismisses the concerns of her family is very similar to the way that she describes her mother doing so.
God, you're so right, though. That's an incredibly, I would say, well-evidenced point.
And it's further evidenced by the dinner scene, the one of the most iconic scenes in the movie, where Annie stands up, raises her voice, and shouts down Peter at what was until then a sort of somber, sad, everybody knows that they're grieving dinner conversation. And she berates Peter and refuses to console him in this time where Charlie has died, while also saying, nobody admits what they've done. The subtext of that, as we learn later in the film, it doesn't seem like Annie ever apologized or really made an effort to mend the relationship she had with Peter after she, maybe unconsciously, maybe not, tried to set Peter and Charlie on fire.
By the way, I think the people who have ignored us and thought, fuck it, I know nothing about this film, but I'll watch this anyway, that is the moment where they're like, what the fuck?
Yeah, because she doesn't talk about this to her family. She never mentions it to them. She is only talking about this to Joan and briefly to Peter in a dream. And even then, she's not fully admitting that, no, this was a attempt to murder her children. And, to be honest, and we'll get into this more, I think that this whole sleepwalking thing is an excuse. Is an excuse for Annie not to take responsibility.
That's fascinating because I actually have, if you're interested, just to provide a kind of supplement to this, I have some of Ari Aster's own interpretation, and particularly the reason why she almost burnt Peter and Charlie.
Go ahead. I'm very curious.
Ari Aster thinks that subconsciously actions like that, much like her attempting to induce a miscarriage, was on some level Annie trying to resist fate.
I can very much see that. And that's the thing, too, is that, as far as Annie is concerned, though I am going to be arguing from the point that, she is cruel to her family, the actual cruelty goes beyond her. It is there in her mother, and it is there in her mother's private friends and private rituals. Annie, in some sense, is only a byproduct of her mother, in the same way that Peter and Charlie are byproducts of her.
Yeah, the punishment is hereditary.
Exactly. There are moments where Annie is embodying the exact thing she called her mother out on, but there's also some sense that, this is not her choosing to be like her mother. This is inevitable that she would become this way. It is inescapable, and in a sense, it's just like the fate that she is dreading.
A really interesting thing is, in our Angel Dust video that you and I co-wrote, we quoted Jeff Schechter and said that protagonists ask questions and villains make arguments. I think what's fascinating about Hereditary is it is a film where the villains win and are vindicated. So the central thesis of the film is an argument rather than a question, and that argument, I would argue, is there is no choice.
Yeah, and by the end, you just look into Payman's eyes, and you see almost this sense that even Payman didn't have a choice in what occurred.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think the first and last shots are telling, because our first shot is zooming in to a dollhouse in Annie's workshop, which becomes the room, and the last shot is zooming back out, and the scene becoming one of Annie's dioramas once more, and ultimately, the kind of takeaway from that is everyone is a doll, so to speak. Not literally, but in the sense that none of us have real agency. There is only the illusion of agency. And as the question is posed in the class, does it make it more tragic when a person with agency undergoes a horrific fate, or a person for whom the horrific fate was inevitable?
Now that's actually interesting, because I would argue that the men of the house, aka Steve and Peter, are meant to represent Heracles, but in this case, Annie is something outside of that. And Annie, as the person who loves Steve, they are married. I think that this is sort of paralleled by having Peter's crush vocalize Heracles' situation as a detached observer. So in a sense, you get Steve and Peter, who are kind of these hapless puppets of tragedy, and Annie, who is just so slightly detached because of all of them, she has the most illusion of freedom because she is the most delusional about the idea of her own free will.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. At the end of the day, they're all puppets. Annie can just see the strings. It doesn't give her any more control over where those strings pull her, but I think you're right in the sense that Peter and Steve have probably the greatest amount of tragedy in it, because this was actually, when I was watching the very last scene of the film, the last 20 minutes, which, for my money, are some of the most frightening, intense 20 minutes in all of cinema. So fucking scary. But anyway, Meg comes back in and sits down, and it's that terrifying moment where Peter sees his dad's charred corpse, he sees the naked, grinning cultist in the doorway, and then Annie runs at him, and it just occurred to me in that moment, he has no idea what's going on. He doesn't know about Payman, he doesn't know about the cult. Like, we as an audience know it because we've been given an omniscient enough look at the events to put it together. Aside from us, the closest non-directly knowingly cult-involved character is Annie, who, as you pointed out, despite having this illusion of being able to change things, is still utterly powerless to do so. But Peter, in this moment, all he knows is his sister died, a bunch of really horrible things have been happening since, his mum floats and cuts her own head off, naked people, he leaps out of the window, and in my interpretation of the film, the second he hits the flower bed, effectively Peter is dead. And he had no idea what happened in any of it. Like, it almost have seemed so terribly random to him.
Well, maybe not fully random, because if you're a child who has lived most of their life in fear of being burned alive by your mother, and you walk downstairs, and your mother's nowhere to be found, and your father is burnt to a crisp and dead, your mind will only come to one conclusion.
Dude, I hadn't thought of that. That is such a good point. Holy shit. Just, you're so right that he must have come downstairs and thought, fuck, she's finally done it.
Yeah, and then she starts chasing him immediately, and the only thing he can think to do, other than, like, run and flee and get to somewhere safe, is apologize, because that's, like, she kept asking him to apologize, and he, like, how can this teen process the fact that, like, apologize for the death of his sister, which he knows he's deeply at fault for, but Annie never even admits her side of things, so he's just desperately being like, I need to apologize, otherwise I will be killed, just like my dad. Like, at this point, there's almost nothing left for him in this world, and he's just acting out of, like, this cornered sense of a scared child trying to preserve his life.
Yeah, and I think just this horror of, like, I mean, it's worth, if we're, like, thinking really rawly from Peter's perspective, we know that prior to the events of the film, before she entered hospice care, Ellen was, the grandmother, was in the home with them, but not herself. So he's already seen Annie's mother lose her mind after probably having these same suspicions about his own mother since this incident. And it's gotten to this point where it seems like it's all fallen apart. Like, a really fascinating piece of behind-the-scenes trivia, because I hunted down and read the Hereditary script.
Oh?
The script is longer than the film and has some scenes that were cut that deliver what is, I would argue, some, like, I'm glad it's not in the final film, but it's interesting to know because of background information. Basically, Steve, prior to becoming Annie's husband, was Annie's psychiatrist.
That explains a lot.
That's why she's constantly, like at the start of the film, she's like, I don't feel sad. Should I feel sad? And he offers this kind of sage advice. And, to be honest, it makes him seem a little bit less unreasonable for how unwilling he is to believe her, because he knows for a fact she's not been well in the past, and that her family, literally every member of her family but her, has died as a result of severe mental illness.
That's the thing. And I guess we can talk a little bit about it, but the video in question that I wanted to bring up, it frames Steve as a person who cares too little. I find that like really insulting to not only his character but to stoic fathers in general.
It's a very shallow reading of the text.
I'd even go as far as to say as it is not empathizing with the emotional reality of this character. This character who takes medication after the death of his daughter, who we see a tender, quiet scene of him holding her journal and going through the drawings.
He's day drinking at work.
Yeah.
He's got like a fifth of whiskey in his tumbler when he gets the call about Peter.
And who immediately tries to de-escalate the situation after both Annie and Peter have said their piece at the dinner scene. Like, he allowed Annie to express herself, but he realized that there was a certain level that was beyond the pale.
That it was going to be hurting Peter but again, he's a therapist, so he would have the knowledge of, okay, this is the point where it's not constructive.
The thing too is that like he never really gets aggressive in this movie. He never really shouts anyone down, but that's not a symptom of him not caring enough. That's a symptom of him knowing the exact amount of like pushback or input to give in a situation because he's trained as a psychiatrist. I mean, you don't get that in the movie, but you get that he's at least a doctor. You know that he's like a professional of some sort. To interpret that as like uncaring, that just seems to me like not acknowledging that Steve is a positive figure of masculinity.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, at the end of the day, Steve is a character that I think is relatable because while obviously he's doing it for the honourable reason of wanting to be a pillar of stability for his family to rest on when it's clear everything else is falling apart, like, he is hurt by this, and it makes sense in moments where, like, you see him break down weeping at the stoplight when he's bringing Peter home. You can see why the fact that he feels unable to communicate his feelings with Annie because he feels like she's suffering enough. He feels like he can't release in the same way that she can. And I think as a result, in a very human way, that has developed into a resentment of Annie and her theatrics when he's like, as essentially, I'm trying to be the adult here. He basically says as much as like, someone has to protect this family. Like, I have to take care of my son.
You know, and him being her former psychiatrist, it makes their relationship all the more tragic and sad because he's invested so much into Annie, not just, you know, personally and romantically, but professionally. Like, Annie is essentially, if he is the love of Annie's life, Annie is his life's work. And the family they've built is the result of that. That's why I think when Steve hits his low point, very soon before his horrifying death by fire, he is holding his deceased daughter's notebook covered in kerosene, and his wife is begging him to throw it into the fire, begging him to throw away this cherished memory of the child he's already lost.
Believing it will kill her.
Believing it will kill her too. And this is the moment where he, like Peter, in a moment of desperation later, like, you know, tries to apologize, tries to placate. Instead of, you know, playing along again, Steve owns up to the fact that he's been indulging these delusions. Like, the seance was this point where he's like, he maybe didn't fight hard enough to stop her from doing this. And he realizes all of this and he's like, we need to get the authorities involved. This is over my head. I admit that I am not capable of dealing with this. This has gone too far, and that she needs help. And I, even as a psychiatrist and husband, have failed her in some sense. And I think that's a powerful moment. That shows that he cares.
No, absolutely. I think the real beauty of Hereditary, I mean, to say one thing is the real beauty of Hereditary is always going to be so reductive, because what makes it such a brilliant film is that it's like this puzzle box that can be approached from so many different angles. And in fact, I would venture to say you could, over like a period of days with lots of self-care in between, watch this movie 5 times and do it from the perspective of, with each like watching, focus on one of the major characters in each one and you're getting a different experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Like, this is a film that encourages deep empathy.
I think my interpretations are mostly focused on Annie and Steve in this one. You could easily like view this movie as being like about Peter. You could even like in some way you could even interpret like the cult. The movie could be about them because in some sense what they extract from them is wealth and riches that maybe this family was never even capable of achieving. Maybe this family was in some sense too fractured, too broken, too weak already to survive in the cruel world that is just acquiring wealth and power. Now that's a pretty shitty way to like view the lives of human beings, but it's the cult's perspective, and I think you could view the film through that lens.
I mean, there's that fantastic letter that is revealed early on in the film, and I think it's particularly fascinating because in the script, the like little postcard that Ellen left for Annie is viewed at the moment where she puts it all together and finds the scrapbooks. Whereas in the actual movie, I would argue it's been wisely moved to very early on, because it has a very different feeling depending on which scene it's viewed in. And there's that frightening thing that is like, don't mourn your losses, the sacrifices will pale compared to the rewards.
Yeah, that is also an example of a scene where Annie sees this apparition, this ghost, and half-heartedly almost tells Steve what she saw, but doesn't, and keeps the secret.
But that's the thing. What's so, like, frightening is every decision made by every character in this movie at every point in this movie makes total sense given who they are and what the context is. And that is what I think it truly means by there being no choice. Because let's dissect that moment. Annie, who has this history of mental illness and who is together with her former psychiatrist, she knows what he's gonna think if she says, I just saw the apparition of my dead mother in the art room.
I'm kind of seeing that scene in a different way now that you brought up that history between them.
It really contextualizes so much of the film.
I get it now. Like it's almost weird that isn't like noted anywhere. I think that a lot of like, you know, Steve's reactions to like, you know, the dioramas, to the fact that Annie destroys her art at one point, to just his like, you know, soft insistence that certain things should be as they are, you know, for the sake of his family and his son. Even what I would say is the choice that leads to probably the most suffering is his choice very early on in the film to not tell Annie and Peter about the grave being desecrated. I think that's the choice that he makes that does the most damage to the family, but it's, again, also an understandable one, like Annie's was.
I mean, that's the thing. It's like, every decision that could have saved them is a decision that, given their contexts, they never would have made.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, there's this common kind of annoying talking point in modern YouTube criticism, which is a statement I find myself saying a lot in these videos, but I think that reflects more on YouTube than me.
You are now seeing what I've been seeing since I began this channel, that YouTube criticism hasn't quite evolved to the point
of seeing the forest for the trees.
Yeah, of coherently understanding why movies work, what they're doing, and what the point of talking about them is in an analytical way.
Yeah, and one of these things that really annoys me is the villain's plan is stupid because it relies so much on chance and so many things happening. And what's so frightening about the plan of the cult in Hereditary is that there are a few points in the film where you see what was clearly their initial plan fail, and then they adapt. The pivotal moment being the close shot of the, like, post slot in the door, the mail slot in the door, when the leaflet for the psychic comes in. But obviously, because everyone in this house is depressed and harried, they're not checking their mail, so they don't go to the psychic. So as a result, they're like, okay, that didn't work. We'll have Joan do direct engagement. If that hadn't worked, you could probably bet that, again, they would have just kept trying. until it happened, because they have what is called the informational advantage. They know so much more than this family, and they have the means and the knowledge to keep going until basically the events of this film would have transpired one way or another.
Exactly. And that's why it's a movie about fate. Not because, everybody was put on this path to make these events happen exactly as they were, even though you could argue that's what happened. It's the fact that the cult and their relentless desire for greed is above the heads of all of these protagonists.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is, it's all there in the, Invocations book, where they say, so they have to destroy the female host to Payman, because he's covetous of a male body, so that was inevitable. And we know from early on, from that scene where Peter is smoking weed in his room when they come back from the funeral, he's smoking next to the window so he can blow the smoke out so his room won't stink of weed. But you see in the distant shot, in the foreground, cold breath. So they had people posted outside the house from the very beginning. There was not a single moment where they weren't watched and manipulated and controlled by this cult.
In some sense, even though this film is about fate, it is ultimately Annie engaging in private rituals with private friends and bringing that back into the house, doing her part of the invocation by awakening the spirit of Charlie, that the ritual is allowed to take place, that the conjuring is later fully allowed to progress. It's a choice she makes, in some sense, I think, as almost a subconscious way to be included in the inevitable collapse of her family.
At the same time, though, it is vital to know that, the choices... I think it's a really interesting question of consent here, because it's something where it can't really be made due to the limited information. Again, as I said, the cult always have this informational advantage. They're always a few steps ahead, because, all of this had already been planned. And again, to refer to the Invocations book, the bit that was literally, highlighted with highlighter pen said that it works best for the host to be vulnerable. So they had to do what they could to fracture connections within the family, so no one could basically power of love Payman out of Peter. That's why it had to be the family that did it. It had to be them breaking their own bonds. A scene that, gets me every time, just in how genius it is, but because of the magician, sleight of hand, you'd never look. The bit where Joan runs into Annie outside the craft store, leads back to her car. If you look into the back of Joan's car, you see a box that says chalkboard, $14.99.
Yeah, the same chalkboard that she uses when she's calling upon the spirit of her grandson Louis, allegedly.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It was never Louis, because it wasn't his chalkboard. It was just, Payman playing pretend to get in the house. But the fact is, we know for a fact, either cultists were already in the house, hence the words were scratched into the walls.
Yeah, and they moved the dead body up there.
And I think something I only noticed on the latest watch, just, goddamn, the fucking imagery in this film and the layered symbolism and repetition is so dense. The bit where Annie is, screaming, "I just want to die, it hurts too much."
Yeah.
She is in the exact, pose of, prayer that her headless body is in at the end. At the Payman altar.
Yeah.
There's just this repeated imagery that reinforces the idea of inevitability.
Yeah, I get the feeling that, this proclivity to death is, Annie kind of has this character arc from resisting fate, but not taking responsibility to giving into it in some sense and being I will be the arbiter of death. But all of this is going on inside of her subconsciously. I don't think she's actually lucid enough to know that this is what's happening to her.
Well, the fascinating thing is, there's that great moment, which is just before Steve's horrific death. She does kind of atone for her mistakes, where she admits that she was the one who brought it into the house, that it was her fault, that she shouldn't have done this, and now she's going to atone and take responsibility by what she believes is going to be burning herself and losing her own life. And I think the dark cruelness of this movie, but also what makes it so genius, is that, like, her actualizing, her reaching the end of this arc, her finally making the right decision, didn't matter.
Yeah, it's what kills Steve. And essentially it shows that even within Annie's own definition of like what a family should do for each other, take responsibility, own up to mistakes, even that doesn't matter because the cult is like wants this family dead. It wants them broken. The cult and Payman want what they want, and you know, it was out of their hands forever.
Yeah, I think the cult are agents of fate, in a sense.
It's like Heracles, you know?
I think Ari Aster again. Thank God I've obsessively watched so many interviews with this man that I can basically.
It's
we can
helpful,
act.
yeah.
We can act as though he's here on the podcast with us by me just parroting out things he said before.
Someday.
Yeah. Oh yeah, some fucking day. But he said that in a lot of ways, this is a film about how sometimes a terrible thing will happen to a family and they just won't recover. And it's a dramatization of this idea of that they say that sometimes what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but other times what doesn't kill you is actually just killing you slowly.
You know, I've actually kind of turned around on some of this stuff.
Tell me more. I'm fascinated. Just gonna turn the lights on in this room real quick.
Well, the next thing I was going to talk about is, because I think we've addressed the family enough, we'll get back into them a little bit, but I wanted to actually talk about Payman as a character in this film.
Go on. And I'm so curious to see how this discussion has altered your opinion on that. So let's give us the before and after.
I just want to preface this with, I'm going to be talking about Payman as a character, and when I say character, I don't mean like somebody who walks and talks and contributes to dialogue and makes choices. I mean, in this case, a character in the same way that the city in Sin City is a character, that the machines in the Matrix are a character. Payman is a character as a sort of framework or a fixture or a device that allows this movie to work. But they do have a voice and they do speak, though infrequently.
Yes, no, I completely agree with all that, so proceed.
I think a very surface level interpretation of this movie, and I'm not like degrading this in any way because I think it's valid, is that the Charlie we know throughout the first act of the film is Payman inside of this girl's body, and that her actual consciousness is either elsewhere or deeply suppressed, and Payman is the one who is doing a lot of the speaking through her.
Yeah, no, that is one of the more common interpretations, and I think it's one that Ari Aster himself was copped to, though, interestingly, I've never actually liked that interpretation.
Well, here's the thing. I don't fully believe it. I think that the Charlie we know is a mix of Payman and Charlie. Otherwise, she would be aware of her situation as being Payman. I think, though, the clicking noise is a Paymanism, and that comes through her and also is heard, you know, in the air itself. It is a sort of power over the air that can exert itself. As Peter says at one point in the movie during a supernatural happening, the air is flexing.
Yeah, and the other visualization of Payman is the flashing light.
Yes, yeah.
Probably one of the most interesting scenes in the film in regards to analysing Payman is the scene in which Charlie sees the flashing light while she's making one of her little toys.
Exactly, and she's called out, essentially, to, like, summoned to this place out there, which may have been another attempt to take her life, honestly.
Yeah.
Until Annie comes out and brings her back, to which Charlie responds, "I want Grandma." Because this mixture of Charlie and Payman, no matter how much one or the other is in this vessel, Payman wants to be conjured and to enter this world, and Charlie wants this person who she knows or at least feels loved her and cared about her.
I think what's so interesting as well in regards to this is the scene in the bed with Charlie talking to Annie, which is the most kind of tender scene between them.
Yeah.
Because Annie feels like she has quite low patience with Charlie in all the other scenes. But it's in those moments where, like, Charlie said, like, she wanted me to be a boy, rather than, like, I wanted to be a boy.
Yeah.
Which I think supports your idea of this duality, which I much prefer as an interpretation that perhaps Payman was bound to Charlie, but the personality isn't Payman.
Yes, and there's two pieces of evidence that I'd like to put forward in like cementing this theory before we move on. One is that in Annie's initial talk with the grief counseling group, she speaks up about what happened to her older brother, who committed suicide after thinking that Ellen was trying to put people inside of him, which it puts forth this idea that, like, the demons are put into the vessels, but the original soul in there doesn't fully leave unless a full conjuration takes place, like we see throughout the entire film.
Yeah, and it's likely that Charlie merely just didn't realize the difference because Ellen got in so early.
And the second piece of information, if Charlie was there inside in some sense being suppressed by Payman or existing in that body, I think that when they actually do the seance, it is this way of getting Charlie separate from Payman. It's part of the cult's plan not only to set up the conjuration, but also to bring Charlie's soul out, because they bring it into Annie, who starts speaking like she's terrified and like she's afraid and like she's like a scared little girl. And the Charlie we know from Act 1 never showed fear, was never like afraid of things. Like, even when they were about to die, they were just explaining what was going to happen to them. They were never this level of afraid. So what I'm thinking is that the Payman and Charlie spirits got disentangled, and part of the purpose of that seance
is illustrating the difference of a Paymanless Charlie.
Exactly. It's just Charlie herself. And that's what's so terrifying about it, is that, like, yeah, maybe that is just this scared girl who doesn't know what's happening to her family. And maybe that is the last we hear of actual Charlie in the film, you know, and she dies twice, essentially.
The one very strange thing, though, that kind of, like, I think what has made this an element probably worth talking about, like, 2 years later, is the moment in the end where Joan addresses what used to be Peter as Charlie, then tells them that they are Payman. That's one of the most baffling scenes in it, I think.
I think that may be an example of the cult maybe not fully getting what they're conjuring, because they're in it for the money, let's face it.
Again, something I feel I should declare my biases here. I really wish the last 2 minutes, save like the last 10 seconds, weren't in the film.
Oh, yeah, so like the whole speech.
The bit where Joan speaks to Peter, like everything up to when she starts speaking to him, to Hail Payman, to me is the weakest part, because it kind of takes the air out of such an otherwise electric finale. To me personally, it smacks of studio. Like it feels a little bit like they need to know what happened. It needs to make sense, because it's like I feel like everything that Jones says, a diligent audience would have picked up.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the movie Dark City?
I know of Dark City. Are you about to tell me about the, does it have, like, in some versions, a studio-added, like, opening crawl that spoils it all?
Not an opening crawl, an opening, like, monologue from one of the characters where they basically say what the entire premise of the film is, something that you would diegetically and organically realize if you were, like, watching it.
Yeah, and a similar thing happens at the end of Psycho, when the psychiatrist just spoon-feeds you everything that context clues have given you about, like, what the situation with Norman Bates and his mother was. It always smacks of, like, condescending studio heads underestimating the audience.
You're right. I think that is completely fair, because this is people acting out of some perceived idea of the lowest common denominator, for some reason going to watch Hereditary. It also feels very, like, last minute, because Joan is entirely off screen, and they might have just been using lingering footage focusing on Peter's, like, 1,000-yard stare.
Yeah, it could have been ADR'd, which is quite funny, but I've got to tell you, the first time I saw this movie in the cinemas, these two, like, older, sort of mid-40s, like, laddish guys came and sat next to me, like, guys who were, like, talking through, like, a lot of it, and I was like, oh, you motherfuckers. But I remember at the very end, when the credits started to roll, they got up and one said to the other, my head hurts now. And I feel like that was the guy that, like, all, like, studio executives thought this film would be for.
Oh god, those are those same people who are like, they'll watch Cabin in the Woods and they're like, what the fuck? This movie doesn't make any sense. What happened?
No, exactly. I think part of the reason that Hereditary is one of those classic things that, God, I'm going to sound like such an elitist prick, but generally, I can tell when I'm going to like a film if on Rotten Tomatoes, which overall obviously means nothing, it's not just numbers, read the actual fucking reviews, you troglodytes.
Please do that.
As like a lay of the land on whether I should watch a movie or not, if I'm like thinking, I could go either way, let's have a look. If it has a really high critical rating and a really low audience rating, I'm like, okay, we're in for an interesting movie.
Yeah, generally.
No, because here's the thing. I'm sorry if the folks at home get offended by this, but the average kind of person writing audience reviews on Rotten Tomatoes is not someone whose opinion I want on movies.
Legitimately, because you can get like a critical review that like goes into the movie's themes, and then the thing is, people take the like entire number, the aggregate of like, this movie got 27%, but do you know what like 70% of those reviews are? Pee pee poo poo, this film bad, acting bad, movie bad, I hate this one. No. Worst movie I've ever seen. Like, that is the bulk of what these user reviews are. And that's not knocking, like, hey, if you're out there and you're a Rotten Tomato user reviewer and you're like, every review I do has multiple paragraphs and I cite my sources. It's like, good, I'm not talking about you. Also, you don't exist.
No, that's the thing, Gus. It's like, well, whenever you're buying some, like, mundane utility product, like, I don't know, vacuum cleaner or whatever, I'm always wary of, like, the reviews on them, because I think I have to remind myself, the reviews written on this are written by the kind of people who write reviews on vacuum cleaners. Like, do you know what I mean? It's like, it's one of those things where the reason this movie got a backlash is because critics hyped it up for being super fucking scary, because it is. Because if you go in and you actually engage with it in an empathetic way, there is no way that you can't leave this thing feeling shaken, even if you never, like, scream in the theatre. But the thing is, all those critics saying that and talking about the deep emotional, like, harrowing nature of it, you get waves of twats wanting like The Conjuring 3, like, piano chord jump scare fest, who are really pissed off that a big scary face isn't running at the screen every 10 minutes.
Exactly. They wanted like a big like boing sound effect as some horrifying creature bursts forth from like a closet, and then a man starts stabbing them next to them in the theater, and then they get a phone call saying that their entire family has been hit by a truck. That's what they want. That's the actual theater experience they want for something that's been hyped up this much. But it's like, maybe you can remember that it's fictional, but also engage with it on an emotional level.
Yeah.
But just a thought. Maybe you can understand that. It's like, because you can always be like, oh, this didn't really happen. These aren't real people.
I love that your, like, idiot voice is just, it sounds exactly like Patrick Star.
I don't know what you're talking about, man.
But no, that's the thing. It's like, I'm sure there are people who would call me, like, elitist or whatever, but this comes from the fact that I love the horror genre, and I hate the wankers who say any good horror film is, like, post-horror or elevated horror. And it's like, no, it's horror. It's not a thriller. It's not a drama with horror elements. Like, I want horror to be the best that it can be. I don't want it to be all, like, tits, arse, and jump scares. And don't get me wrong, there's a place for all that too. But when the audiences reject stuff like this as brilliant horror films, which they are, it's an objectively well-made, well-written, well-acted film. It's so fucking frustrating because, like, do you remember the sort of Paranormal Activity thing, where in the trailers, the bulk of it would be, like, footage of the audience jumping? To be like, look how scary this film is, look at these reactions, here's some night vision of teenagers screaming. And it's like, yeah, you can't put a camera on someone and show that Hereditary is making them worry about, like, the fate of their parents, or whether they'll become their parents, or like all these other things.
Well, the thing is, I did put a camera on me, and you have to read subtle facial expressions to understand internally what this movie was doing to me. The thing is, I'm not like every moment going like, "Oh no! Look at the spooky monster behind the door!"
Yeah,
Ah!"
yeah, it's not gonna be some like Doug Walker fucking high-pitched screaming like
Ah,
shit.
it's so scary! Oh god!
Like, it's a film.
This reminds me of the time that it looked like Vegas. Why does it look like Vegas?
It's so true. But no, that's the thing. It's like it's a movie that pushes you inside yourself, but makes inside yourself feel like an unsafe place to be.
Okay, getting back to Payman though. Speaking of like selves inside of other selves,
Yeah.
I think there's another scene where Payman talks directly to Annie.
Go on.
And it is the dream sequence where she walks in and at first she sees Peter covered in ants, and it's a horrifying sequence. And then she's standing in the room and it's still this dream, but Peter says, "Why are you afraid of me?" And Annie responds, "What?" And I thought that was very strange because I don't think Annie is afraid of Peter. And I think that Peter is more afraid of Annie. And so what I kind of pieced together from that is that some of that dialogue about, "Why did you try to kill me? You know, why are you afraid of me? You tried to get rid of me." I think that is Payman still intertwined with Charlie's soul because it's pre-seance, talking through Peter in this subconscious dreamscape to Annie, and Annie basically not knowing who she's talking to and trying to like reconcile her love of Peter with her subconscious fear for fate. And that is why I turned around on something, because based on what you've said and based on reconsidering that scene, I do think Annie was sleepwalking, because the one time that she is free from her fate is when she is unconscious and not being a conscious actor.
God, I think you really have something there, because there's actual textual evidence of some of these ideas, because one of the other times we see what could be called a physical representation of Payman, he's appearing as Peter, smiling as himself. So it's not unprecedented for Payman to basically, like, be already picturing himself in his future host.
Exactly. And it's only later when he's able to project that sneering Peter, it's only after the seance that he's able to do that. He could probably already manifest as Peter in like the dreamscape or in some like some sense, but not in the physical world, which is where he's the most powerful. So in a sense, that scene between Annie and Payman is the only time we get protagonist and antagonist. Annie, who is trying to protect this family regardless of the fact that she has committed these sins in her waking life, and Payman, who represents the fate that, you know, is like, "Annie, stop dragging your feet, stop taking your time, just die, just let everyone die so I can get what I want." It's the only moment where there's an actual clash of ideals between them, because otherwise Payman is on a whole other level. It's a force of the universe itself, in the same way that Annie is creating her dioramas and placing people where they are in these little dollhouses. That is how Payman views this family in this house.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and all of the, like, thematic textual evidence supports this reading, and it's worth saying we have to admire the restraint of all the filmmakers here, because how much lamer would this film be if we ever saw, like, a scary, demonic, Payman's true form monster?
Yeah, that's the thing.
Payman always takes other faces because he is not of the physical world. He needs to be wearing a glove to be able to reach in.
Exactly.
And that's these different people throughout it.
The other thing, too, is that, like, what these cultists are bargaining on, and they may not fully realize it, this all worked out so well for them, because Payman wanted something, wanted to get into the real world, and wanted to be on their side. And what they need to realize is, he may only be providing the services to them in order for someone down the line to do this again. There's no love, there's no, like, genuine care for these cultists' well-being. all humans are the same. They're just essentially a paycheck. They get all this material bullshit they care about, and he gets his vessel and his ability to do what he wills with the world.
See, what I think is really interesting, and this is a strange mix of thematic analysis and literal analysis, I think what's so fascinating is, it seems like, based on the photos of Ellen Lee in her, like, bridal gown being showered with money, and the fact she's called Queen Lee and Payman is called King Payman, there's a kind of, like, unholy union here. But, on top of that, it seems like there's this element of, originally, the deal was, I give you the riches, I take your son's body. But I think the son killing himself was unexpected. Like, that wasn't part of the plan. That, much like Annie and the fam not taking the, like, psychic pamphlet, was a deviation, because it seems like, from the immense wealth and privilege that Annie and Steve enjoy, like, I know artists and psychiatrists get paid, like, pretty well, but, like, huge house, multiple cars, like, all this evidence of, like, opulence and wealth, it seems like they got the payment from Payman up front and then got shafted.
There's also evidence that other prominent members of the cult, because you see those throw pillows, and one of them was for Joni. There weren't that many of them, meaning that these might have been reserved for the higher-up members of the cult, meaning that Joan's tragic death of her son and grandson maybe wasn't so tragic for her. Maybe this was part of things.
Yeah, no, it's a question of, like, how many people they've gone through to get to this point.
Exactly, because maybe there's a photo album somewhere in Joni's place where, you know, there's a picture of them, a shrine of, like, the son and grandson, and that this was also part of the payment. Maybe all of them have, in some sense, killed their relatives, and the house where Queen lay, spent her final days, that was just the fulcrum of this ritual.
Yeah, that was actually something that I'd theorized as well, because it seemed to me that if Joni was just straight up lying about those family deaths just to get into, like, Annie's sympathy, it feels like Ellen really got fucked on this deal.
Yeah.
Compared to the rest of the cultists. Like, she had to give up her entire immediate family and the next 2 generations, and it seems her own sanity.
Yeah, well, that might have been because she fucked up with trying to, like, put Payman into her son.
Yeah, and I think it was telling that was the original plan, because Charles, who was Annie's brother, it seems, his doormat was the only one that actually had the Payman sigil embroidered onto it.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Also, that means Charlie was named for him, which might have been a decision influenced by Ellen.
God, you're so right. That, like...
Oh!
The first child was just meant to be, like... Here's how I kind of picture it playing out behind the scene. And I know this is kind of beyond thematic analysis, but fuck you, our video, we can discuss this shit, we love this movie.
Yeah, exactly.
But, like, it seems like what happened behind the scenes is, okay... Charles died. I'm sorry, King Payman, but don't worry, we'll get you another Charles real quick. Like, oh shit, Charles is a Charlie. Will you be willing to take this as a stopgap while we get another one?
Yeah, exactly. And, like, Annie, withheld Peter from Ellen. So what happened was, it was the second child, and it was a girl, and this made Payman super mad. And actually, that's one thing I wanted to point out too, because maybe part of why Payman was, like, saying, like, you tried to kill me in the dream sequence to Annie, if we're to accept that interpretation, if being in the wrong sex of body is a problem, I can imagine that it's maybe a little bit of an inconvenience to be burned alive.
I mean, not just that. In that moment, because Charlie and Peter were sharing the bed, it would have been destroying the host Payman was currently inhabiting and the one he wanted to inhabit at the same time.
Like, Payman might have even assisted in Annie waking up, was like made sure that striking that match would be the thing that pulled her out of it, because he's like, no, you have a job to do, you motherfucker. Like,
Yeah, like, you have to do your part. Like Oedipus or Heracles, there are emotions that you need to go through to, like, make this happen. It's like, genuinely, like, Hereditary might be thematically one of the most frightening horror movies of all time, because it's so nihilistic.
I think it's probably the best movie about, like, demonology that I've ever seen.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is there's a YouTuber called In Praise of Shadows, who I really like. He's an incredible YouTuber. He said he didn't like Hereditary, or couldn't get into Hereditary, because he was so distracted by its, like, surface level plot similarities to Rosemary's Baby. But I would argue that as far as the films are concerned, not taking the book in it, because the book by R. Levin, Rosemary's Baby, great shit. But I actually think that Hereditary is a thematically richer film than Rosemary's Baby.
Well, yeah, I mean, and presentation-wise and structure-wise, it's just far more interesting. This would be like being like, oh, the Haunting on Hill House is the same thing as Houseu. Like, that is a wild reduction of both properties, I would say, without even going into which one you prefer.
And if we can get personal, to the best of my knowledge, Aster isn't a nonce, so I find it easier to enjoy Hereditary than Rosemary's Baby.
Hey, shots fired, and fired well.
Well, what's weird is there are always, like, Roman Polanski, like, defenders, but even more common is, like, Woody Allen defenders, who are just constantly searching his name on Twitter. Because I remember once I made a post about Woody Allen, like, talking about the fact that he's done some pretty awful shit, and immediately had, like, 3 different replies, being like, you don't know the full story! You're just buying into the propaganda on Woody.
That's the thing. When you're suddenly just declaring somebody's level of knowledge about a public figure unrelated to any sort of policy or government matters as propaganda, you're A, using the word poorly, and B, way too unhealthily invested in the conflict.
It's true. But yeah, I think there's, like, something about Hereditary that, like, I said this to Meg this morning while watching it. It is a film that feels evil.
I'll be honest, like, after seeing it 3 times, I almost start to buy into the movie's self-described lack of cruelty, in a sense. Because, and that, too, is something evil about it. Because after you give it a few watches, you start to feel less like it's this entity bent on your destruction, and more like it's a machine just meticulously going about its business, its purpose unknown to you, but it will function regardless of who's caught in its gears.
Yeah, there's this line from the book, I believe it's the book version of Silence of the Lambs, but if not, it's Red Dragon. But it's Hannibal Lecter says it, and he's like, he's talking about, like, the inherent, like, amorality of God, which I think in this case we can kind of substitute for faith. And he's saying, like, I collect clippings on church collapses. I saw that, like, a few months back, he dropped a church roof on a whole room full of his worshippers. Like, could you call that evil? And then he ends with saying, typhoid and swans, they come from the same place. And I think the same can be said for Hereditary's approach. Like, even though the Hand of Fate in this case is literally personified by one of the 8 kings of hell and a greedy cult, it feels like the mechanicians are so beyond anything that could even be recognizably human that you're right. It becomes amoral. You can't call it evil because, much more so than Thanos, it's inevitable.
Oh God, yeah. Don't even bring that purple sack of shit into this. That fucking, like,
I would give Thanos his body as a host for payment.
That would be the most horrifying bullshit for fanfic. That would be the, like, a power scaler's wet dream to just be like,
Paimos.
what if Paimon from Hereditary possessed Thanos, and then they gained the power of the Shimmer from Annihilation, and they learned the language of the heptapods from Arrival, and they it's like all these things that don't belong in power scaling suddenly through the lens of Thanos become this like, oh shit, he could time travel, manipulate fate, and he'd have the Infinity Gauntlet. Whoa!
It's like vertical meets horizontal power
Not to
scaling.
mention the power of DNA melding that he'd gained from the Shimmer, which is definitely a conscious process and not just a result of being exposed to the strange field.
/ a metaphor for self-destruction and grief.
People who don't understand metaphors or themes obviously have nothing to get out of Hereditary, because all they see is a bunch of shit that happens.
That's the kind of people. They'll be like, well, it was really boring, and then it was just a bunch of cliche demon stuff at the end.
Oh, god damn it.
The problem is, the reason so many internet people don't get Hereditary is that you need to admit a bit of vulnerability.
But nobody owns up to anything they do!
Some dude out there who's called, like, I don't know, the sarcastic drinker, or something like that.
Yeah, or like...
Which is probably a channel that exists.
Booze reviews.
Ironic booze reviews.
Man about
All
film.
these cunts exist. But, like, all these different things that are, like, these people who, the way that they engage with art is, ah yes, it is I, the disconnected critic, who does not himself exist, merely drawing out of the ether the concrete observations which one can lay upon this object.
No, it's so stupid, because...
That's not the mind you need to go into Hereditary with.
Exactly. You go into it with a human being's mind, and then you come out a machine. If you go in a machine, nothing about you changes.
It's so hard for me to put myself in the shoes of someone who doesn't get Hereditary, because that's a viewpoint so fundamentally alien to my own.
It feels like if you don't get Hereditary, or at least are not in some way unnerved or frightened by Hereditary, I have to wonder if you've ever loved anybody. I have to wonder if you have any sort of connection to this world, any care, anything that you treasure. I'm genuinely serious. I think that if you, like, the only people who would be like, yeah, everyone got what was coming to them, and that's okay, are literal demons.
Do you know, by the way, who is a huge fan of Hereditary? And I'm not kidding.
Who?
Martin Scorsese.
Whoa! The very man who was like, Marvel films are theme parks. Wait, no, I should specify. Comic book movies are theme parks. The DC fans don't get an easy out on this one.
He said when talking about Hereditary, the tragedy of the family, and how your heart aches for them, and how the movie beautifully brings you in and then hurts you for being brought in, is, like, masterful. And, of course, on the level of construction, it's masterful too. And I feel like there are correlations here.
Exactly. This man knows what he's talking about.
I feel like the Venn diagram between people who hate Hereditary and think Avengers Endgame is a masterpiece is like a circle.
Yeah.
Wait, no, not Endgame. Infinity War.
Yep, that's the one. That's the objectively good one. What I was going to say, on a slightly related note to superhero films and the people who comment on them and critique them, Renegade Cut's Hereditary video fucking sucks. It blows. It broke his brain to watch this movie, and he clearly didn't get anything from it. His entire review is just a bunch of navel-gazing, insulting the characters, and not understanding what's really going on. The implications of which are perfectly laid out in the text if he gave it a chance and wasn't just stewing in his own clear uncomfortability.
But Gus, how could a man that boring not be right? Because clearly, if you're making no effort to make your content interesting, it's because your points are so brilliant that they don't need to be varnished by such things as style and fun. What did he say about Hereditary, just so I can get angry about it?
I despise the presentation of Renegade Cut's channels. And there's a lot of stuff I agree with him on, clearly. But as a very passionate guy who puts a lot of himself and his emotions into his work, I just can't fathom why you would want to be so detached, so dull, so boring, and so without, the barest amount of God, it frustrates me, and you can tell that I'm legit about this.
Yeah, doesn't anything feel more authoritative when being said to you by fucking Ben Stein? Just like,
I hate it.
The most droning dull person you've ever heard.
Well, yeah, I mean, some of the choice things from this video in question are, again, I mentioned it before, but saying Steve didn't care enough. Also, this weird diatribe about how, like, we're always children in our dreams, and we've survived our childhoods, therefore it couldn't be that bad. And really, this weird uplifting of...
That's some school of life shit.
Yeah,
What?
yeah, no, that's the thing. It's this weird uplifting of, like, all matronly figures in a way that is completely... runs counter to everything about this. Even if you could argue that Annie is sympathetic, and there's credence to that, I'm not going to say my interpretation of her being kind of a malicious figure is the only one, but... Ellen is not a good person, and she is the one who damned all of them to this suffering, to this literal damnation. It is this weird, like, infantile,
But how could a mommy be evil? They're meant to help their kids.
Man figure bad, woman figure good, when at the end of the day... This is nostalgia. This is like childhood nostalgia manifesting in a way that Hereditary clearly brought out only repressed feelings of wanting to return to childhood. There is nothing else.
So what was his actual point? Like, what was his thesis?
Fuck all! There is no substance in that video, and like I said before, comments are disabled. There's no like and dislike, so nobody can even ask, what did you mean? And not all his videos are like that. Some people can elect to have that be a consistent thing throughout their channel, and whatever. That's their viewpoint. But for me, the lack of it on this one video shows that, yeah, this is just a bunch of, like, bullshit that he shat out and didn't have, like, any further discussion to have from it. And the fact that it exists at all is, like, it's the most shallow, the most baseless, the most, like, nonsense Hereditary criticism. And you know how I know that? It's because I watched it first before I watched Hereditary a long time ago when I had just discovered his channel. And then, after watching it, rewatched it, and I was baffled. I had no fucking idea what he was talking about. And half the footage in that is from other movies that aren't even addressed, that aren't Hereditary. It is a fever dream, dude. It is a less coherent narrative than the unrelated dream I had last night. And I rest my case.
Like, I feel like you can kind of, people at home, you can tell that this long kind of freeform retrospective is very sincere because it's not like we're hopping on an algorithm trend 2 years after the fuck it came out. Whereas I imagine with Renegade Cut, it was like, well, I better have a video on Hereditary, or the algorithm will turn its grand eye away from me and instead onto the million Hereditary ending explained and 14 things you missed in Hereditary. A joke, but I love Cece's World. It's a lot of fun.
But what do I talk about in this very interesting, intricate, emotional film when I display no emotion and am very boring? I know, vague, sad things that people can relate to.
I definitely won't talk about The Boys, because I won't watch The Boys.
I won't watch
Watch
The Boys.
the fucking Boys, you coward.
Also, the cinematography in Aquaman is bad because sometimes the camera spins around signifying intensity, and other times it spins around signifying nothing.
Oh, beautiful.
More like Renegade Butt.
Beautiful. Something that I think would be worth... So, do you have any more notes?
No, I said pretty much everything. There was more, like, being mean to Annie, but I don't think she deserves it. Like, I was gonna bring up the fact that, she neither calls the gallery nor the police throughout all of this, and that's kind of indicative of not wanting help with the grief, not wanting to, like, let on that she's vulnerable. But, I'm willing to recognize now that some of that might be informed by, like, how that would make Steve feel. In a sense, they're both protecting each other from their own grief and sadness, which is part of the reason why they get so screwed over in the end, which I think at least they were doing it for the right reasons. It's kind of unfortunate and tragic, but they did clearly love each other.
I think as well, worth saying, just to the gallery point, like, I don't know about you, but when I'm in a really bad place and, like, I'm kind of procrastinating on something I need to do, I definitely slip into a state of denial. And it's kind of, look, if I don't look at it, it doesn't exist.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, that's
Like,
also
I imagine to an extent the gallery was the last thing on our mind. But the thing that I wanted to say was, I think we've dealt with like a bulk of the thematic stuff now. I'd really love to, just for a little while before we end the video, talk a bit about the technical aspects of like writing, acting, filmmaking, and just some of our like favorite moments and stuff like that, because I feel like that's also worth discussing for a film that is this masterful. Did you know that no scenes in this for the Graham house were actually filmed in a real house? It's all soundstage because they always just have one of the walls removed to create that like voyeuristic feeling of looking into the dollhouse. It's why there's often these quite like alienating wide shots of these cavernous rooms with tiny looking people in it. There's such a level of artistry to it in every single, like, the production design, incredible. From the books of like incantations and Charlie's little kind of fetish dolls. Fetish in the anthropological sense, not the
yeah,
sexual
not like
sense.
she doesn't have like
Obviously.
body pillows in her room or anything.
Yeah, no, exactly. But like all of these just elements of like the actual physical construction of this movie that makes it like I would call Hereditary an oppressive watch.
It's oppressive, but in a sense, the fine attention to detail and the intricateness of everything in it, like, it becomes beautiful after a while.
Yeah, no, that's the thing. It is a beautiful movie, and it's hard to reconcile sometimes the stark emotional and occasionally like physical brutality on screen with the gorgeous way that it's filmed.
And I'd say that, like, maybe some of that was partially carried over into Midsommar, another movie that, like, is gorgeous to look at and very uplifting in a sense in terms of its like sunlit visuals and happy people and flower crowns, but again, the brutality of some of the things that go on in the film comes at such a it feels like such a cost to look upon something so wonderful.
Yeah, I think in horror there are these two different extremes. On one side you have like the Rob Zombie school where it's like everything is like dirty and grimy and horrible, like the kind of like hillbilly core, like violent nastiness, where it's all gruesome, and it's been done in great ways, like the first two Texas Chainsaw movies. But I think it's also been done in ways that I'm personally not as much a fan of, like Rob Zombie's movies. But on the other side, you have the Ari Asters and Jordan Peele's of the world, where their philosophy is putting despicable things in gorgeous and gorgeously shot settings. Whether it's this fabulous house in Hereditary or like the gorgeous like beaches and just like California setting of Us.
Yeah, Us is beautiful to look at. Film is a visual medium, and I find that a lot of people on YouTube don't even talk about aesthetics at all and how these like inform the tone, inform like how you're meant to engage with the film. Because like, how could you not look at that like scene in Hereditary where like Annie walks out of the store and meets Joan and it's in the sunlight and she's talking about like, you know, this stuff and not feel a little bit like weirdly uplifted?
No, that's such a comforting scene in the way it's lit. It feels like a lo-fi beats to chill to playlist, like Golden Hour in Utah.
It feels like a little like, you know, blanket wrapping you up and being like, oh man, you know, somebody's found something good in this movie. Even to the point that like the weird scene with like, you know, Louis, quote unquote, coming back to life, all of that feels like, oh wow, like this would be the first act of like, you know, a friendly ghost movie or like a reaching out to Beyond the Grave movie. Like there's something about it where it's like, wow, you know, this is the guide who's teaching Annie magic. And I think to an extent, Annie feels a certain way about that too, even though it terrifies her, and it should, because, you know, that reaction is warranted given what happens later. There's something just kind of joyous about it.
And Ari Aster knows that as well, and is obviously like playing into that expectation which is what makes the revelation, if it wasn't spoiled for you, that Joan is kind of now the de facto head of the cult, like, even more upsetting and makes you realize, fuck, the one thing that we thought was, like, a rope being thrown down to them to help them out was actually a fucking noose.
It's truly amazing, and like I think that the Joan character arc is or the not the character arc of Joan, but the arc that Annie goes through with Joan, I feel like is almost the heart of the movie.
Well, yeah, because it feels like it feels like Joan is her only friend. Like, Annie is such an isolated character.
She doesn't really tell anybody that she's made friends with Joan or that there's this positive thing in her life. She just kind of like brings that into the house, and it's again like the cult making people vulnerable for the sake of their plans going through. Like, demons win when we give in to our own demons.
I think as well, like, this is a movie that it's so profoundly unfair.
Yeah, it's not fair in the slightest.
I'm not gonna lie, like, it's why I so genuinely want, like, if you came to this channel for, like, Has Been, Hell of a Boss, Long Gone Gulch, Lily Orchard Hate, please watch Hereditary, really engage with it, and just, like, actually let yourself feel the feelings that it gives you, and you'll realize how truly transcendent art can actually be.
I'm going to go a step further and say, yes, I agree with everything Henry says, but also go out and watch more films. Don't just watch children's cartoons. Don't just watch cartoons that are adult, quote unquote, but clearly cater to a teenage audience. Don't just watch the things that everybody is talking about at the present moment. Seek out a wide array of tastes and find out what truly reaches you. That's the whole point.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, because one of my philosophies for trying new things has always been you never know you can find your new favorite thing. And the fact is, not long ago, I know this for a fact, Gus, you really weren't into any kind of horror.
Yeah, well, that was a couple years ago.
Oh no, it was a couple years ago now, but like Hereditary's a couple years old, and it was between one of your other friends and Meg and I pressuring you that you've kind of seen more of them now. And I think, while of course that there's still a lot in the horror space that you wouldn't feel comfortable engaging with, like, you've realized some of the cool shit that the genre allows for, and that's something that never would have happened if you weren't willing to take the first leap of faith.
Also, I just feel like there's this intense feeling of catharsis within me right now because like I've just suddenly like started releasing nervous energy by like tapping my leg rapidly. Like I feel like I've gotten out what I need to say about this movie. I feel like I've seen it. I feel like I've recognized its genius. I've given a pretty damn good interpretation of it myself, and now my entire body is jittery with the joy of like, oh, now the rest of my day is not going to be Hereditary. I can be happy again. I can be a little bit less focused on the misery of this family.
Isn't it so fascinating that this movie that we've just, like, discussed glowingly and given this full, like, thematic read-up to show just the power of, like, different varieties of cinemas like this, part of you is like, now thank fuck I don't have to think about it ever again.
The weird part is, it's like, even though all this like stress and tension is leaving my body, like in a weird way, Hereditary made me very happy today.
No, exactly, because
I got to talk about it with you, and because we got to like go so deep into it, and like because it's such a good film. This is what good film, good horror, good anything can do. It can like it can release you, not escapism, because escapism is when you go into it and then you return to the world and you feel upset. This instead is
yeah, horror makes you feel glad you're living your life and not theirs.
Yeah. You take some of the movie into yourself, you feel it, you process it, and then you let it go. And that's how like grief and love and life and all of that stuff is. It's truly remarkable.
The metaphor I've always used for it is, I hate good dreams, because I always feel disappointed when I wake up from a good dream, but I feel relieved when I wake up from a nightmare.
Exactly. And that's the relief that I feel right now. And that's the relief you might be able to feel, audience, if you watch Hereditary. The first time you're going to feel miserable. The first time you're going to be
very afraid. You're going to like it is going to get you there.
I feel like I probably should say, as the resident horror evangelist here, it is, I think, important to disclose, like, you do, like, don't spoil yourself, but, like, know what you're getting into, because, like, horrible things happen to people who don't deserve horrible things happening to them. Like, it is nasty, it is bleak, it is really fucking scary. Like, genuinely, like, there will be times when you're watching this where you will think, I want to get out, I want to get out. We obviously recommend that experience, but, like, be ready for it. Like, don't go into Hereditary lightly, or you're going to, you maybe won't regret it straight away, but, like, that night, when you're in your room, and it's dark, and it's time to go to bed, that's when you'll think, Henry and Gus, why the fuck did you tell me to watch that film? So this is me warning you now, that might happen. It happened to me. It happened to Gus.
All right. I think that we've done a really great job with this.
Yeah, this has been our Hereditary retrospective.
Does Hereditary work or doesn't it? I'll leave that up to you to decide when you go watch it, viewer. Until then, I'll be seeing you in the future.